The Christmas tree was still lit when I found the envelope. It was tucked beneath a stack of mail on the kitchen counter. The kind of counter I had scrubbed for 40 years, the kind that still smelled faintly of pine cleaner, no matter what season it was. My daughter-in-law had placed it there, I assumed, the way she placed most things in my house lately. Without asking, without explaining, as if the whole place had already been transferred into her name. The candles on the mantel were burning low. My son had gone to bed early, claiming a headache, and she had followed him up the stairs with that particular silence she wore like a second skin around me. The grandchildren were asleep in the back room. The house was mine again, the way it always felt after everyone else stopped moving through it. I poured myself a glass of water. I stood at the sink and looked out at the backyard, at the pecan tree my husband Eugene planted the year we bought this house in 1987. He was gone now, 7 years gone, and sometimes I still expected to see him out there in his green flannel shirt, checking on that tree like it was one of his children. I turned back to the counter. I picked up the envelope. It was not addressed to me. Let me back up. My name is not important to this story. What is important is that I am 69 years old. I worked 31 years as an administrative coordinator for a regional hospital system in Charlotte, North Carolina. I know what paperwork looks like. I know what certain words on certain forms mean. I spent 3 decades watching doctors and lawyers and insurance adjusters use language like a tool, sometimes to help people, sometimes to carve them open quietly while they smiled at you from across a desk. I retired 4 years ago. Eugene was already gone by then. I had my pension, my savings, the house, and what we called the quiet account, a separate investment account. Eugene and I had built over 20 years that my son did not know about. We had kept it private on purpose, not out of secrecy, out of wisdom. Eugene always said, "Never let your children know the full number." Not because you don't trust them, because money changes what people see when they look at you. I thought about that a lot this past December. My son, I'll call him by what I called him when he was small, because some habits die hard. My son Terrell is 43 years old. He works in commercial real estate in Raleigh. He makes good money, always has. His wife Melissa, and I want to be careful here because this is not a story about hating my daughter-in-law, even if it might sound that way. Melissa came from a family where money was a topic discussed openly at the dinner table, where inheritance was not a gift but an expectation, a line item, a plan. They had been married 11 years. I had watched Melissa slowly redecorate my son's expectations over the course of that marriage, the way she redecorated every room she entered, removing what was already there, replacing it with something that suited her better. I still loved my son. That was never in question, but I had begun in the last 2 years to notice things. The questions that were not quite questions. "Mom, do you have a financial advisor? Mom, have you thought about what happens to the house? Mom, Terrell and I were talking, and we just want to make sure you're protected." The word protected used the way people use umbrellas, as something that benefits the person holding it. The suggestions that came packaged as concern. You shouldn't be in that big house alone. What if something happened? We worry about you. I had heard this language before, in hospital corridors, in family waiting rooms. I knew what it was scaffolding toward. But I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself that 2 people could use the same words for different reasons, and I did not know their reasons yet. Then came Christmas. Terrell and Melissa arrived on the 23rd with the grandchildren. My grandson Eli, who is 8, and my granddaughter Cora, who is 6 and has Eugene's eyes exactly. They pulled into the driveway in the new SUV Melissa had chosen, pearl white, with a 3rd row I had never been invited to sit in. My daughter, I have a daughter too, Her name is Renee, and she lives in Atlanta and could not make it this year because of her husband's family obligations. My daughter had called me the week before and said, almost in passing, "Mama, just pay attention this trip. Something feels off to me, and I can't name it yet." I told her she was worrying for nothing. I set the table on Christmas Eve, the way I always set it. The good china that my mother had given me, white with a thin gold border, the crystal glasses Eugene bought me for our 20th anniversary, the centerpiece I made every year, pine branches, red ribbon, the small ceramic nativity that had been on every holiday table I had ever sat at since I was a child in Greensboro. I cooked for 2 days, the turkey, the sweet potato casserole with the brown sugar crust, the collard greens simmered with smoked turkey neck the way my grandmother taught me, low and slow, with a little apple cider vinegar at the end. The macaroni and cheese, baked, not the kind from a box. The cornbread dressing, the green beans with the pearl onions. I baked 2 sweet potato pies and a pound cake. When I carried the last dish to the table, Melissa was already seated. She had poured wine for herself and Terrell. She had not asked if I wanted any. She had not offered to help. She had been sitting at my dining room table, in the chair I usually sat in, scrolling on her phone. I sat at the end nearest the kitchen. I put my napkin in my lap. I waited for my son to say grace the way his father had always said it, short, sincere, with both hands flat on the table. He said grace. We ate. Melissa commented on the macaroni being a little dry. She said it nicely, the way she said most things, with a smile that was technically a smile. I said thank you for mentioning it. She talked about a property Terrell was developing near the Research Triangle. She talked about the school they were considering for Eli. She talked about a trip they were planning to Portugal in the spring. She did not ask about me, not once, not how I was managing, not whether I had plans for the new year, not whether I needed anything. I was the woman who had cooked everything on that table, and I was also, somehow, a kind of furniture. Later, when I was washing the dishes, Melissa had gone upstairs with a headache, and Terrell was watching football. Eli came and stood beside me at the sink. He picked up a dish towel without being asked. He drew the crystal glasses one by one, holding each one up to the light the way children do. "Grandma," he said, "do you like living here by yourself?" I looked at him. "I do," I said. "I've always loved this house." He thought about that for a moment. "Daddy says it's too big for you." I kept washing. "Does he?" He said you might move soon. I turned off the water. I dried my hands. I said, "You know what I think about when I look at that pecan tree out there?" He shook his head. "I think about your grandfather, and I think this house is exactly the right size for all those memories." He nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. 6-year-olds and 8-year-olds sometimes understand things more cleanly than the adults who think they're protecting them. It was the next night, Christmas night, when I found the envelope. I had already said good night. I had already watched the children open their gifts, already seen Melissa photograph everything, for reasons that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with audience. I had already eaten leftover turkey, standing at the kitchen counter, while the 4 of them sat in the living room, Terrell and Melissa, talking about something in low voices, the children absorbed in new toys. I had not been called in to join them. I had not been asked. I told myself it was an oversight. Then I told myself the truth, which was that it was not. I poured a glass of water. I looked out at the pecan tree, and then I picked up the envelope on the counter. It was not sealed. The flap was tucked in, the way you tuck something when you intend to seal it later, but have not gotten around to it yet, or when you have left it somewhere in a hurry. I should not have looked. I have thought about this since. Whether what I did was wrong, whether I violated something. But it was my counter, in my house, with my name, not my son's name, not his wife's name, my name, on the deed that had been filed at the Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds since 1987. I slid the papers out. There were 3 pages. The top one was a cover letter from a law firm in Raleigh. I recognized the format immediately. I had processed hundreds of similar documents over 3 decades in healthcare administration. It was a durable power of attorney inquiry. Pre-filled, my son's name was listed as the designated agent. My name was at the top, in the space marked principal. I had not been told about this. I had not been asked. I had not signed anything. This was a draft, or a proposal, or something someone had been holding, waiting for the right moment to present to me. Presumably after a conversation in which I had been softened up sufficiently. I read all 3 pages. Then I read them again. I put them back in the envelope. I tucked the flap in exactly as I had found it. I set it back beneath the stack of mail. I turned off the kitchen light. I walked upstairs. I got into my bed, in the room where Eugene and I had slept for 34 years, and I lay in the dark listening to the house breathe the way old houses do. I was not angry. Anger would come later, in smaller and more manageable waves. What I felt in that moment was something closer to clarity. The kind that arrives when you have been almost seeing something for a long time, and then suddenly you see it completely, all at once, and there is no going back to almost. I thought about my daughter's voice on the phone. Something feels off, Mama. I thought about Eugene. Never let your children know the full number. I thought about 31 years of paperwork and what certain words in certain places on certain forms actually meant. And then I made a decision. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way I made most of my important decisions, quietly, completely, with no announcement and no need for one. I waited until the 27th, when Terrell and Melissa had gone to take the children to see her parents in Cary. They would be gone until evening. I called my own attorney first. Her name is Cynthia, and she has handled my affairs for 12 years, since Eugene's estate was settled. I told her what I had found. I read her the firm's name from the cover letter. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Loretta, and then she caught herself and said, I want you to come in on the 28th. Bring any documents you can access. We need to review everything. I said, I already know what I want to do. I just need you to help me do it correctly. She said, all right, tell me, I told her. Then I called my financial advisor, a man named Arthur, who has managed my investments since 2009. I told him I wanted to restructure the accounts. I told him which names I wanted removed from anything that had a name attached to it other than mine. I told him about the quiet account, which he already knew about, and I told him I wanted it moved. Institution, routing number, everything, before the end of the week. Arthur did not ask questions I hadn't invited. He said, I can have the paperwork ready by tomorrow afternoon. I said, good. After I hung up the phone, I sat at the kitchen table for a while. The pecan tree was visible through the window. A cardinal had landed on one of the lower branches, a red male bright as a match head against the grey December sky. Eugene used to say that cardinals were people who loved you, coming back to check on you. I thought, I see you. Then I got up and made myself a proper lunch, the kind I hadn't made for myself since, before they arrived. A bowl of the leftover collard greens, a piece of cornbread, sweet tea in the tall glass, with the chip on the rim that I had never thrown away because Eugene had chipped it, and that made it worth keeping. I sat down at my own table, in my own chair, and I ate. Terrell called on the 29th after Arthur had already sent me the confirmation emails and Cynthia had already drafted the documents I would sign that afternoon. He said they'd had a wonderful time at Melissa's parents'. He said the kids were asking about me. He said he hoped I'd had a restful couple of days. I said I had. Then he said, Mom, we've been wanting to talk to you about something. Something important. Melissa and we've been concerned, and we just want to make sure you're set up properly going forward. There's some paperwork. I said, I know about the paperwork, Terrell. Silence. I said, I found the envelope on my counter on Christmas night. More silence. The kind that tells you everything about what a person had prepared to say and nothing about what they are actually feeling. I said, I want you to know that I am not angry, but I am done. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, I have spoken to Cynthia. I have spoken to Arthur. Everything is exactly where I want it to be, structured exactly how I want it structured, with my name on it and only my name. If and when I decide to make changes to any of that, it will be because I decided to, on my own terms, with full information, not because someone left paperwork on my counter and waited for me to get tired enough to sign it. He started to say something. I heard Melissa's voice in the background, low, asking a question I couldn't make out. I said, I love you, Terrell. I will always love you. But I am 69 years old. I ran administrative operations for a hospital system for 31 years, and I know exactly what durable power of attorney means and what it is used for. You should have talked to me, not drafted something and left it in my kitchen like a bill. He said, Mom, it wasn't. I said, I need some time. Let's plan to talk in the new year. And I ended the call. My daughter flew up from Atlanta on New Year's Eve. She did not ask. She just texted me, I'm coming. I'll be there by 3. I picked her up from the airport in my car, the one I bought myself 2 years ago in cash, because I could. She walked out of the terminal and looked at me the way daughters sometimes look at their mothers, like she was checking for damage, and relieved, and a little furious on my behalf, all at the same time. She hugged me in the parking deck for a long time. In the car on the way home, she said, Tell me everything. So I did. She listened. She did not interrupt, which is one of the things I love most about her. When I finished, she looked out the window at the highway and said, Mama, how are you? I thought about how to answer that honestly. I said, I feel like myself again. I didn't know I had stopped feeling that way until I started again. She nodded. She reached over and put her hand over mine on the gear shift. We drove the rest of the way home without talking. I made black-eyed peas for New Year's, cornbread again. We sat at the table, and I let her pour the wine this time into the crystal glasses with the gold rims, and we toasted Eugene because we always do, and then we toasted ourselves, which we had never done before, but which felt right this year. Outside, the pecan tree was bare and still and very much alive. It had survived every winter since 1987. It would survive this one too. I want to say one thing clearly because I think it matters. I do not believe my son is a bad person. I believe he is a person who listened too long to a voice that told him his mother was a resource, and that resources need to be managed, and that managing them early is just good planning. I believe he told himself this was love. Maybe some part of it was. But love does not draft paperwork behind your back. Love does not decide what you need before asking what you want. Love does not seat you at the end of the table in your own house and wait for you to become tired enough to be convenient. I have changed what needed to be changed. I have protected what needed protecting. I spent 31 years in a system that tried to reduce human beings to files, and I refused to let it, and I will not let it happen in my own kitchen. My granddaughter Cora called me on New Year's Day. She said, Grandma, I miss you. I said, I miss you too, baby. She said, Can we come visit in the summer? I said, Of course. I'll make the macaroni just for you. She said, The good kind? I said, Always the good kind. I hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening to the particular silence that belongs only to a house that is yours. The radiator ticking, the refrigerator's low hum, wind in the pecan tree outside. I opened the kitchen window, just enough to let the cold morning air move through, and I breathed. I was still here. Everything I had built was still here, and it was going to stay that way.